Illegal undercover spies are real. They live among us and pretend that they're American citizens. Today on Deviant Off Script, we're going to talk to a former KGB spy who lived here illegally pretending to be American. His name's Jack Barsky, and he's lived a hell of a life. Thank you so much for joining us here on Deviant Off Script. It's so great to have you. We're all very excited to have you. I guess to start off, it's strange because the name of this show is Deviant.
I was thinking about it.
You tell everyone we have on this version of the show that you being on this doesn't mean you were a deviant, but your world, the spy world, can straddle the line, right? Have you ever considered yourself, before we get into your story and the things you did, on the deviant side of things?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, my daughter Chelsea and I participated in a documentary that she did with A&E, and we had a conversation back and forth, and we both agreed that, and this is a quote, "We are not normal." Whether that's the definition of deviant, we deviate from the norm. Mm-hmm. My entire life, I was not in the center of the bell curve, and I'm still not. That's not an achievement. It's just a fact.
Yeah. I mean, the act of espionage itself, your former KGB, it takes a special type of person to do that. And I think different people have different reasons for getting into your line of work, especially the kind of spy that you were. You were what was considered an illegal. You were here in the United States for 10 years, back for the Soviet Union. I guess just to start out, you were born in East Germany. What was your life like starting out? It's a fascinating journey to get you from there to here.
I had what I then thought was a normal childhood, because during my early years, I was not a deviant. Everybody else lived the same life. I was raised in the countryside, and there was a lot of poverty, but no destruction. This was just right after World War II. I was born 4 years after the end of that war. There was very little destruction, but the medical system was almost non-existent. The food was terrible. We were malnourished, but yet so everybody else was too. I had one advantage. My parents were both teachers, and teachers were very well treated by the emerging communist regime, because they were supposed to teach the new generation of leaders. And so I grew up until I moved to the city where I went to college. I grew up in houses that were attached to school buildings. And it was very safe. It was quite comfortable. And because of both teachers, both parents made a good income, in hindsight, in the context of society there, we were upper middle class. My dad had the first private car in town, and we had nice vacations. I had no reason to complain and feel miserable.
Yeah. And just to set the stage for everyone, at the time, East Germany was a client state, satellite state of the Soviet Union. So there was the East German government, which was heavily allied with the Soviet Union. But before we get into you moving into Soviet intelligence, set the stage for the control that Russia had.
Interestingly enough, the Russian troops were never visible. They were in facilities that were surrounded by high fences. I'd seen East German soldiers in my village once, but I never seen the Russian outside. And as a matter of fact, we were supposed to, these were our big brothers. When I was in high school, we had an initiative to meet with some local Russian military. We couldn't. They stayed in the back. But in hindsight, I know that dictated which way this part of Germany was going to go.
I guess you didn't see a lot of Russian military. Did you feel the presence of the Russian political apparatus, the KGB?
Well, it really depends what age I'm at. What I now know is that I was subject to brainwashing from the day I entered kindergarten. But there was no direct link to Russia that was orchestrated by the East German communists and their allies, because we had a united front of 5 parties. The other 4 were heavily infiltrated by communists. I remember I voted once. I don't remember the other times I voted. You got a list of candidates, and they were United Front candidates. You could either check the whole thing and put the ballot in the box, or you could cross one out. But that was somewhat unusual and even possibly dangerous, but because there were poll watchers and there were Stasi, East German secret police.
Yeah.
So the election results were typically 95% in favor of the United Front. All phony. We were called the German Democratic Republic. Yep. The only word in that title is German. That was the only word that was actually accurate and true. There was no republic and no democracy.
So interestingly, you get to college, and let's talk about how you went to work for that state. You eventually made it to the KGB, but how were you approached? Was it East German intelligence at first, the Stasi, or was it?
No, it was, and this is a misconception that I don't know how that evolved. In other interviews, I told the interviewer that the first contact was made by a German national who spoke German without an accent.
Yeah.
There was not a remote thought in my mind that I would be approached by KGB, so I thought it was Stasi. When we had a chat, he introduced himself as a representative of a very famous optical firm called Zeiss Jena. Mm-hmm. That was the premier company in the town where I studied. He sort of indicated that he was about to recruit me to work there. That was pretty much asinine because he didn't even know how our country functioned in those days. Once we had our diploma, when we were done with our program, we were assigned. The top 10% of the class was able to continue studies to get a doctorate, and then we were assigned. So there was an idiotic cover story. So when he introduced himself as that kind of an individual from that company, I knew it had something to do with Stasi. Well, after talking back and forth, he invited me for lunch. And at that lunch, he introduced me to a fellow he introduced by the name of Herman. And when Herman said hello, he had an accent. So this guy who never introduced himself, not even with a cover name, the German guy said, "I'd like to introduce Comrade Herman. We work with our big Soviet comrades." And then he disappeared. So that's how I got to the KGB.
Why you? Like that question must have been one of the first that crossed your mind.
No.
Really?
I learned very early on that not to ask any questions. I learned this when I asked Herman whether his real name was German. That's a Russian equivalent of Herman. He got pissed off. So I learned not to ask any questions. And I never questioned that. This was just something interesting, and I was going to take a look at what they had in mind. And to go to another country, to take on a different identity, and in my case, actually change nationalities, and then say, I was born in New Jersey. They were looking for a whole set of character traits that are sort of pre-existing. These are not skills. You can't acquire them. You can learn a little bit, but I give you some samples. Obviously, they were looking for really smart people. The foundation, by the way, was I had to be 100% a follower of communist ideology. I was a member of the party, and I was active in the youth movement at the university. You had to be smart. You have to be quick-witted. You have to be able to make up stories on the fly to get out of tight situations. You had to have no problems whatsoever changing scenery, moving to another country, saying goodbye to your history. My favorite of all those traits was controlled inclination to adventure. I have always been adventurous. I always wanted to do new things. I've always been curious and check out stuff and take risks. I took physical risks as a child and got injured several times. And so you put this all together, it took 18 months to study what I had, 18 months.
And at this point,
they made the offer.
So KGB is looking at you for 18 months. And at this point, Do you have family? Do you have a wife and child?
No, that was also pretty much a requirement, even though unsaid in that interview. When I was finally recruited, I was 24. And if I had been married at that time, married with child, that would have been a non-starter.
Yeah.
The possibility would have existed that if I married and the wife would be acceptable as a partner to go with me, such as in the Americans,
Yeah.
they liked that. But actually, I met a colleague of mine, the only other illegal that worked for the KGB in the 80s. When he was recruited, he was told to find himself a wife, and he did. So he came to the U.S. with a wife. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
If you send illegals out, husband and wife, it makes it easier for them to defect. But they are not lonely. I was alone, but I could handle that. Eventually, they allowed me to marry when I was already active in the U.S. Allowed me to marry in East Germany, and that meant I had an anchor back home, which would have made it fundamentally impossible to defect. Eventually, I had a wife and a child.
The job offer, if you will, when the KGB actually made the offer and made it recruited. What was that moment? What happened?
It was a big surprise. I tell you, there's one thing that throughout my interaction with the KGB, they were incredibly careful to keep everything secret. It was just a lot of talking and feeling each other out. So I was traveling to Berlin. I met my new handler there, and he gave me some training, West German literature to read, and we talked, and I guess he continued the evaluation. The next to last day of my time in Berlin, he took me to the headquarters of the Soviet Army and the KGB. I still remember there was a long hallway. We walked towards the end of that and opened a big door and stepped into a highly luxurious office. That was the office of somebody who was high up. And I'm guessing now he was most likely the head of the KGB in East Germany. That's not a bad guess. And was a short guy sitting behind a huge desk. You could see from about here up. But when he opened his mouth, he went like, whoa, steely voice out of a small body. He had extremely strong psychological presence. Spoke only Russian. I understood enough Russian because we had a lot of Russian classes in high school as well as in college. So I understood quite a bit, and there was a translator when I didn't. And he just started with a bunch of propaganda, and I'm thinking, why we're doing this, why the KGB, so that we're fighting the evil capitalism. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't need this shit.
You got me.
And then I think this was a setup because, while I'm thinking, all of a sudden he switched the topic very aggressively. And he said, out of the blue, he said, so what, can we count on you? Are you in? I don't remember the exact words. He said it in Russian anyway. That's why I said it was a surprise. I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't see it coming. I came up with some verbiage that helped me not to have to say yes or no right away. I said, I don't know if I'm qualified, and I don't think I have the training. And he just stared at me and said, we know that you're qualified, and we will train you, but we work only with people who can make quick decisions when it comes to important decisions. So you got until tomorrow noon to say yes or no. That made for a sleepless night, I can tell you that. I went back and forth. I loved the town where I lived. I had a great career ahead of me. My passion actually was, my number one passion was basketball. I was in the starting lineup of the college team, and that was my family away from home. If I had a love interest, I would have most likely said no. I cannot, in hindsight, I don't know what I would have done.
At the same time, though, it must have been, given where you came from, that must have been pretty damn flattering to have the head of the KGB and to say, "You're ready. We want you. You be one of us."
You read my mind. My ego was very much enhanced by that offer.
Sure.
And of course, the adventure, the ability to travel to the West, and the ability to actually break laws, because I never liked to be told what to do. I was anti-authoritarian by genetic design, I believe. I almost got kicked out of high school once because I misbehaved all the time.
Yeah.
You put it all together, and the fact, and that was very important, that I knew I would serve a noble cause. You don't sign up for something like that unless you think this is part of the purpose why you're on this planet. I said yes. They told me I had to learn another language. And they gave me a choice of languages. And we had, in addition to Russian, we had German, and in college, and German, and we had English. And that came to me like I didn't have to study. I was very natural, so I picked English. And I threw myself into English like I always do. When I take on a task, I give it 110%. Competitive, right? Ambitious. So I studied like a maniac, and I started out from scratch again. I was able to hire a tutor, and then I started with English 101, and then I went on to finding another tutor with whom I could have a conversation, and a third one. And I read a lot of books, and every word that I found that I didn't know, I learned. So it's about a year into my time in Berlin, maybe a year and a half, and I get a visitor from Moscow and came to my apartment. We talked about this and that and what the future might hold. Then he asked me, "How's your English?" I went to the bookshelf and I pulled out a novel, and I said, "I can read that without a dictionary." I don't know what went on in his mind, but apparently a light bulb went on, because a week later, my resident handler in Berlin, gave me a tape recorder, and I was told to just say something in English, speak for 20 minutes about whatever topic. And a week later, I was on a plane to Moscow, because apparently the people who listened to this thought there might be somebody who is very special there. So in Moscow, I was interviewed by a born American, a lady who had fallen in love with a Soviet diplomat and wound up in Russia, and a professor who taught English at Moscow University. She was obviously KGB. And so we talked for maybe an hour, just a conversation. And then they had to give feedback to the decision makers. The question was, can he acquire an American version of the English language with almost no accent? And it was a tie. The Russians said no, but, Americans are a little more optimistic. And the American says, "I can work with him. I think I can get him there." Oh, she was right. So that's how I wound up in Moscow for 2 years, primarily to study English.
Coming from East Germany to Moscow, what was that change like? What was your impression of Moscow in the mid-90s?
Well, first of all, it was cold.
Yeah.
It's 6 months of winter.
Yeah.
There were no drunks in East Germany. There were no homeless in East Germany. There were a lot of drunken men in the streets. The grocery stores, the supermarkets, if you will, had a lot more to offer than the Soviet ones. And overall, the architecture and the city was glamorous, Moscow. But the standard of living was significantly lower. One other thing that impressed me highly was the subway, metro. Almost every station, except for the ones that were newly built, felt like a room in a castle. Incredible and always on time. There was always a train the next 5 minutes, and just totally amazing. But overall, if I had a choice at that point to live there, I would have said, no, thank you.
So this was sort of your espionage graduate school period.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. At this point, clearly you're being groomed to go to America.
Yeah.
What did you learn with the KGB in Moscow, at Moscow Center.
The most valuable training I got in Moscow was tradecraft, particularly counter-surveillance and interaction with other agents like signals and stuff like that. I also learned how to drive there, but surveillance detection while driving in heavy traffic by yourself doesn't work.
Right.
You know how it's done? It's typically done, you need another person who will know which route you're taking and position themselves ahead of you and see if a vehicle is following you, the same vehicle is following you, and then signal you, hey, you're being followed. We didn't do that. So it was English and counter-surveillance, and that was, and some other stuff like, almost like an afterthought. I was trained how to recognize what kind of a ship I can see at a distance. Visual recognition of, I forgot what they're called. I never really used that knowledge.
Yes, just in case they wanted to put you on the coast and,
visual observation of the coastline to determine whether there's preparation for war, something like that.
Yeah.
There is this misconception that people like me had phenomenal training to learn what it's like to live as an American. I was training I got, whatever hints I got, what it would be like to live as an American was given to me by the clueless. You got to understand, the folks that thought they would give me good advice, they had lived in the United States as diplomats under diplomatic cover. They lived in a glass house. The majority of them in New York, they lived in a compound in the north of Manhattan. Some of them had family with them. So their official job, they had colleagues that they also lived with. Yes, they had interaction with American citizens, but
they didn't have to be American.
The American citizens would know that they were talking with a Soviet diplomat. So they had no clue what it would be like to apply for a job, date somebody, get an apartment. They had no clue what it was like to live as an American. And I give this example that really it sheds a interesting light on this. I used to live in Atlanta, and they have this huge aquarium. It's humongous. And you can stand in front of it, and there's so many fish, and you just watch the fish, and that doesn't teach you what it's like to be a fish.
Very true.
So the agents thought, because they had watched the American society from the outside, they knew everything there was to know. And they were the experts. There were no other experts.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know what they didn't know. They gave me a lot of misdirection, a lot of wrong advice. I had to learn this by osmosis, very slowly and very carefully. What the KGB did well, they recruited people who could do that. I never met a KGB psychologist. Never. Psychology was not in the mix of my training. They relied on the fact that they had recruited the right caliber of person who could be successful. And they were right about it.
After graduate school, if you will, you get Assignment America. How did that come about? What was your first, when were you given your mission?
You can call it the final exam, or the final semester of graduate school was a 3-month trip to Canada to get a feel for what it might be like to be in the United States, and also take care of the sticker shock of the wealth that I would witness as soon as I step off a plane in the United States. So 3 months, I had some tasks there to do some reconnaissance as to what at the time there was a separatist movement in Canada that Quebec was going to become its own country with French as the primary language. And they wanted me to figure out what the Canadians thought about it. And I also had to find a couple of spots for dead drops and acquire a genuine birth certificate, a copy of a birth certificate for one Henry Van Randel. Henry Van Randel was known to have passed away at a young age. that failed miserably because what they didn't know, in most cases in the United States in those days, there was no cross-reference of death and birth certificates. But this particular office did the cross-reference. And so when I got in the mail, when I got the birth certificate, it was stamped across in big red letters, deceased.
Oh.
You know, that's the epitome of deviant, because here was a dead person who asked for his own birth certificate.
Yeah. So you come back from Canada with the mounted police on your heels, and you get back to Moscow. Then it's time to go to America.
Now I didn't have a document I could use. I was supposed to be, right?
Right.
So it was time to come up with a plan B.
Oh, so you were in Canada to find your own fake identity.
The primary reason that they sent me to Canada, to come back with the birth certificate of Henry Van Randall.
That's who you were getting.
And I came back with it, but it said
deceased.
They told me, okay, go back to Berlin and study Portuguese and read as much as you can about Brazil. Now, I learned many years later that this was one of the favorite countries to smuggle people into the U.S., a way station. It was, and it still is, pretty easy to obtain Brazilian citizenship using forged documents. We would never go to the United States, the country of destiny, with a forged document. That's too dangerous. But you would go to Brazil, live there for a while, acquire citizenship, and then legally immigrate to the United States. So I studied some Portuguese by accident. There was a diplomat agent in Washington, D.C., who wandered around in a cemetery in Maryland, a Jewish cemetery, and he found the gravestone of Jack Barsky. Born in 1944, passed away at the age of 11. He acquired a copy of that birth certificate, and he was able to get that without having to give proof that he was entitled. And I think initially he wanted the death certificate, if I'm not mistaken, and then parlayed that into a birth certificate.
Interesting.
Insane that you were able to do that. Probably not anymore, but we have other security holes now. They're mostly internet-based.
So you have an identity now. It's Jack Barsky. They bring it back to you.
Yeah. Now it was time to go.
Now it's time to go to America. At this point, you're given your mission.
Yeah, the mission was initially to do espionage in the realm of foreign policy, get close to people who are involved in making policy and or influence foreign policy, such as particularly they were interested in conservative think tanks. But the focus for my first couple of years was to acquire genuine U.S. documents so I could live.
Yeah.
And then...
This is 1978.
And the whole idea was for me to spend 2 years, get a job, then acquire a genuine Jewish passport, and then go back to Moscow for some interesting resetting, using that American passport to move to either Switzerland or Austria and start a company there.
Oh, interesting.
We didn't talk about what company, but that was brilliant. That plan was brilliant because the KGB was very good at money laundering.
Yeah.
So within 2 years, I would have become a wealthy entrepreneur in one of those countries and could move back to the United States with money, at which point I would have been in the upper tiers of U.S. society. I could have joined a country club because money talks. If you have the money, you can join practically any country club.
Sounds good. That was the plan.
Sounds really good.
That was the plan.
Was the plan. Another failure.
What was the reality?
The reality was that the fault lied both in the instructions that I got in Moscow and my own self.
Yeah. As you mentioned, you weren't quite prepared for America by your handlers or
yeah, no, I had everything it took as far as documentation. I had my driver's license, genuine American, New York driver's license. I had the birth certificate, and I had proof of residence. That's all I needed to get a passport. Yeah. And they told me in Moscow to go to the passport office in person. That was a mistake.
Hmm.
And then my mistake was that when I filled out the application, I just didn't think about it very clearly. And we actually practiced filling that out in Moscow, but they couldn't have anticipated the situation I was in. There were two questions that tripped me up. First question is, what's your profession? At the time, I was a bicycle messenger in Manhattan. Made pretty good money. They paid us as contractors. Very few people would want to take that. So I made good money, but I wrote messenger. The majority of messengers made minimum wage. Right? So what do they need a passport for? And then there was another section where it asked, what country are you planning to go to and when are you planning to go? So here I am dealing with somebody, an agent in the passport office who was most likely more qualified than the people that operated, with the mail stuff. He scanned this thing and said, I have some doubts about your identity, but let's see if we can fix that. And he pulled out a questionnaire. He said, could you fill that out, please, and come back to me? I said, okay. I was still confident that I would pass this, but the first question clearly indicated that I had just blown my cover.
Or you
maybe not, because the first question was, where did you go to high school? And I had, in my backstory, Jack Barsky had attended Peter Stuyvesant, a school for the gifted, which was also a mistake. All right. And I had then attended high school and dropped out. But so I pretty much knew there was no record of a Jack Barsky, which is an unusual name in the U.S., attended Peter Stuyvesant. I knew I was pretty much busted. But again, that was one of those moments confirmed they hired the right guy. I went back to the counter and I cursed under my breath and I just was really angry and I waved the questionnaire and I don't need this S word. And I saw that the agent had the application and my documents still in front of him. So I grabbed that stuff and walked out. I saved whatever I could save after having made that dumb mistake. Normally I should have been arrested or I'd investigated at least. Okay, he may not even have remembered my name and couldn't report me. So now after a couple of months, I increased my surveillance detection and found that I was pretty much in the clear. So when I then went back to Moscow and told them the disaster, they came up with a plan B, get a college degree, then get a degree in economics, and then get a job on Wall Street and make money that way. I actually overrode that because when I enrolled in college, the base program that required a course in information technology, it was a time when IT started becoming of interest to a lot of people, particularly this was a business school. So I had to take a course in IT. And as part of that, I was required to learn one of the top computer languages called Fortran. Mm-hmm. Since I had a background in science and I had taught math in college in East Germany before the KGB recruited me, I was very much attracted by the ability to tell a machine to do some calculations that I normally would have to use mathematical integration for. So I informed the KGB in a letter in secret writing that I changed my major. I was going to do information technology. And I had so much credibility at that point that they said, great idea.
Yeah. The Soviet Union was really behind the West.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
100%. You are very well informed. I was sent to be a sleeper agent and I was supposed to do foreign policy. Mm-hmm. The last visit to Moscow was in 1986. I met an agent from a different directorate, most likely industrial espionage, who asked me if I could steal some technology. It was on the do not share with other countries list. And he honestly admitted that they were behind, very much so. As a matter of fact, in the Eastern Bloc, the only country that had some usable technology was actually East Germany. Yeah. But all of us in those days, us is now the United States, were woefully behind.
Yeah.
So he asked me if I could get my hands on technology, whether that was software or hardware. I got to tell you one thing that would be of great interest, even though you couldn't ask the question, because that's why I'm volunteering the information.
Okay.
In 1986, I told them I might not be able to get my hands on technology, but I have access to the health records of several thousand employees of companies like Boeing and weapons manufacturers and military industrial complex. And I told them I have access to these health records, and they didn't blink an eye. They did not understand how valuable those health records could be for recruitment.
Because at this point, you've gotten a job at MetLife Insurance, right?
Yes, and I was in group medical insurance.
So you had access to the healthcare records of plenty of people working in defense.
It was not secured the way health records are secured nowadays. It was mainframe based. I had access to all the files. I managed those files. It would have been a lot of work because there were no thumb drives in those days. Sure. I would have had to print it all out. Right. But I would have found a way. Also write programs to screen for keywords.
Yeah.
Because I was good at that stuff.
And I know we're jumping around a bit. When you get to America, you're given this mission to acquire documents and a passport. That doesn't go well. So you're sent to college and you ended up moving into IT. Then you get this job at MetLife Insurance. We're at 1986 right now, and you got there in 1978. During this time, what sort of information or secrets or useful stuff is going back to Moscow?
The first 4 years when I entered college, I had no direct interaction with other Americans. The only interaction I had was with the folks in the messenger office that helped me learn what it's like to be a New Yorker.
Oh, interesting.
What television they watched, the baseball heroes, football, all the stuff that is cultural that I didn't learn in Moscow.
And it must have been like another planet, New York City, in these first 4 years.
Oh, it was for sure. But I was smart enough to know that I didn't know anything and I couldn't get close to anybody. Now, when I went to college, there was City University that was like the United Nations. I stuck out a little bit because I was 10 years older than the average student. But in terms of, having a little accent, and an accent that was actually explainable because Jack Barsky's mother's maiden name was Schwartz, which could easily be interpreted as German. It is a German name. So that's when I was able to get closer to people, professors and students. The value that I provided at that time was profiling people, particularly students, who would most likely one day wind up in government and would be of interest with regard to recruitment. I was never fed back anything, not even in general, whether that information was useful or not. I also was required periodically send back information about what American citizens thought about certain important events in the world, such as the one that still sticks in my mind is when the Soviets shot down the Korean airliner. To me, I thought that wasn't really valuable, but then again, it was, because I interacted with Americans who didn't filter their opinion, as opposed to the diplomats who most likely just copied a lot of stuff. So I was actually an expert in U.S. opinion, but secrets I had no access to. And the most valuable information I had access to was the health records. Other than that, my hands never touched a document or photographed a document that had secret stamped on it.
I know we need to move to the period where your time with the KGB ended, but before we do that, real quickly, you mentioned something fascinating in the history of the Cold War. It's this period from 1983 to 1984, starting with when the Korean Air 007 was shot down over Russia. That was the beginning of a string of events that some in the Soviet Union interpreted like this could be a prelude to war, some of the United
Yeah.
States. And that sort of culminated with, for our audience, that culminated with a military exercise that happened in 1984 called Able Archer.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was basically a nuclear war practice run on paper, and the Soviet
With nuclear warheads.
yes, and Soviet intelligence, the Soviet government interpreted this as actual preparations for war.
Yep.
Became very close, probably the closest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So all that said, you talked about your training, you talked about what you were there to do. As tensions heightened to this level, was there another element to your job? Was there a paramilitary?
I was required to observe the Naval Weapons Station, Earl, occasionally go there from a distance and do visual observation to see if there was any changes that would indicate the preparations for war.
Yeah, and then
that was awkward.
How so?
That was at the time when I didn't have a vehicle. So how do you go from here to there in the United States outside of a big city without a car?
Yeah.
I was able to get a hold of a bicycle, but it was really awkward. What I had thought maybe would have been a good idea to rent an apartment that I can stay there for occasionally and just do. But again, I didn't have the means, and it was awkward.
During this time, did you receive any messages from Moscow that was like a higher alert level, or whoa, shit's about to pop off? Were you given any indication that things were getting more serious from there?
No, and this is really also interesting that I was never told that in case the war breaks out, us sleepers would not sleep anymore. Mm-hmm. No instructions, not even a hint that this would happen. No idea that there may have been weapons stored someplace and I should explode something.
So you were an active spy for KGB from 1978 to 1988. Come 1988, it's time for it to end. Moscow is actually the one that initiates that. What happened?
We had 2 signal spots where I could interact with the resident diplomats via signals. Both the spots were on the way to work. Mine was on a support beam for the elevated train that got me from Queens to Manhattan on my way to work. And I routinely just checked that spot, and there was nothing ever there. I didn't expect anything. So one morning, it was in December, it was still dark, it was early morning. I see that big red dot. It was loud, it was big, it was very red and the size of my fist. That was the emergency signal, that was danger. So the instructions in Moscow were, if I see that, I have to make a beeline. If I have reserve documents, go get the reserve documents out of the hiding place, someplace in the Bronx, and then make a beeline to the Canadian border, go to Ottawa, ring the bell at the Soviet embassy, and you will be moved out of the Western Bloc and come back home. Mm-hmm. This was a hard command. No hesitation, just go. Well, there was no reason given. Obviously, it was a signal. Go. We know what we're talking about.
Yeah, they had a reason to extract you.
They obviously didn't. I found out what they were talking about because I wasn't ready to leave.
Yeah.
You want to know why?
I know why, but let the people know.
So I wasn't ready to leave because unbeknownst to them, and I knew that they didn't know that, because if they had known that, they would have reprimanded me severely and most likely kept me on one of my visits when I already had a child in the United States. 18-month-old daughter who, at the time that I read that signal, she was 18 months. And I didn't have the means to take care of her mother and the child, to support them in a separate apartment. So we moved in together.
Yeah.
And I watched that little girl grow up. And so the first time she could say da, that was the beginning of falling in love with this child. She was very pretty, like a doll. As I said, she was 18 months and she would always smile at me. This was the first time that I experienced real, true love, unconditional love. The only thing that she could give me was a smile. And I would have thrown myself under a bus if I could save her life.
Yeah.
instinctively. This is wired in the human psyche. And I knew I had to go back to Germany because I didn't love her mother, by the way. I only loved the child. I liked the mother, but I still loved my German mother. And I had a family in Germany.
Including a wife and child in Germany.
Yeah, and I had to go back anyway because you don't defy the KGB. And everything that was good for me personally was over there anyway. I had received the second highest decoration of the Soviet Union in 1986, Order of the Red Banner. That was given to me by the Soviet government. That means the KGB thought I had done a really good job.
Yeah.
I would have had a good life. The wall was still in existence. East Germany was still known to me as a great country to go back to. I was clueless, but so was everybody else. If the wall would come down a year later. So I had tried to figure out how to support her mother and Chelsea from a distance, and there was no way. I couldn't have asked the KGB to help out. They would have put me in jail for that, for insubordination. And I couldn't have asked anybody in the United States. I would have had to make up a story that wouldn't compute. So I was torn back and forth. So that is why I did not do what I was supposed to do. I went to work and was trying to figure out what to do next. Now, I knew I had some wiggle room because they didn't know whether I was still alive.
Because you gave them a pretty compelling excuse for 1988.
Well, eventually, but at this point where I was stalling, I could have been sick. I could have not gone to work that day. There were a lot of reasons. On the following Thursday, that was a Monday, on the following Thursday, I got the reasons why they activated the emergency procedure. They told me in shortwave radio that they had reason to believe that the FBI is investigating me and I'm going to be arrested very soon. Okay, now...
It's good reason.
I activated my surveillance detection procedures and I found no evidence that I'm being followed. So I felt reasonably safe, but now I still had to figure out what to do about Chelsea. And eventually, and that was very spontaneous. It's a movie scene, really, that there was a dead drop operation that I was asked to go to because they thought I didn't have my emergency documents anymore. So they were going to give me money and a passport or some kind of a document to go to Canada. So I went to that dead drop spot, and they usually used old oil cans. There was no oil can in that spot, and that spot was, you couldn't miss it. You couldn't miss it. It was, I found myself, what happened? So, and as I'm walking out of that park, defeated, I went to the drop site to at least get the money. I hadn't made a decision. As I walk out of the park, my subconscious feeds me 3 words: I am staying. But that was the worst, stupidest decision I ever made. If you compare this to a rational decision, that was sort of suicidal, but I couldn't help myself. So that's when I came up with that brilliant idea to tell him that I'm not coming back because I have contracted HIV/AIDS, and there may be a chance for me to get treatment in the U.S. But in those days, there was no treatment.
AIDS was not widely understood then, so everyone was terrified of it.
Absolutely.
And yes, the KGB did not want that in the Soviet Union.
I had this discussion in '86, my last trip back to Moscow, when we were sort of gleeful how the sinful lifestyle in the United States wound up killing a lot of homosexuals. Russians and Soviets, even more so, were very, very anti-gay. So, and they didn't have a good reason to not believe me. The rational thinking said, that doesn't make any sense. He must be telling the truth. And
never followed up. Huh?
They bought into it.
Yeah.
They went to my German family and told them that I passed away. That was in 1988. The birth and death records in Germany today still show that Albrecht Dittlich, my German name, passed away in 1988.
So the KGB bought it and just assumed you were dead.
Yep.
And they never followed up.
Nope.
Wow. So you're free now.
I'm free. So again, this is also somewhat deviant, or at least ironic. They hired me for a number of reasons. One of them is that I could be a really good liar and very inventive.
Yeah.
That was the lie that worked against them.
You're living in the United States. under, still under a cover identity. As far as you know, the FBI isn't on to you. Your life is sort of wide open to you at this point. So what's next?
I knew that I had tried one more time to get a passport via mail. Mm-hmm. That failed. So I didn't want to go anywhere near passport application anymore. Sure. So I knew that I would live my life undercover, but inactive in the United States, never see Germany again, never see my German family again. When that was clear to me, I told my American wife that I would stick with her and we would pursue the American dream. A year later, I had a house in the suburbs. And then we had another child. And then I had another house in the country. I had a good career. I made good money. And I became a family man.
Yeah.
And a consumer. Communist ideology had completely disappeared from my life. Particularly, it was wiped out when the wall came down, and I did research what the heck happened there. And I found out that the things that I was fed growing up and believed in, Marx and Lenin, were fundamentally evil. There was no communism left. I became a consuming capitalist, but not necessarily yet a patriotic American. That came later.
Yeah, your road there is pretty interesting. The FBI had no idea you existed from the time you left the KGB in 1988 until 1992.
Got that right.
Yeah. Then something very interesting happened. Would you like to tell that story?
There was a fellow by the name of Vasily Mitrokin, who was the lead archivist at the KGB headquarters, which at the time when he started there was still at the Lubyanka, down right in Red Square. And he was in charge of moving all these archives to Yasinovo, the new headquarters outside of Moscow. And I don't recall exactly why he had developed this incredible hatred for the Soviet system. If my memory, correct me if you know better, I think his son had an illness for which he could only get treatment in the West, and he was not allowed to take his son to England.
I think you're right. It's been a while since I've read the Mitrokin archive, but I think you're right.
And so he just wanted to do as much damage as he could to the Soviet system, and he had unregulated access to all these paper documents, and he would take every day, he would copy by hand onto little pieces of paper something that he thought was valuable, and then transcribe the stuff at home and buried several cases of documents, which he eventually offered to the CIA, and the CIA said, no, thank you. That was a pretty dumb decision, but he didn't give up. This was when the Soviet Union had disappeared, but the information that he had was still super valuable.
Yeah, these are the crown jewels of the KGB over the years.
You bet, exactly. And he eventually, MI6 was able to smuggle that stuff out of the country and eventually share, I don't know if they shared everything, but shared a lot of stuff with the FBI. And amongst those documents, there was a little note that says, there's a fellow by the name of Jack Barsky. He is an illegal living in the Northeast. That's all they needed because the Social Security files were already digitized. So you could search for Jack Barsky, and they found one who got his Social Security card as an adult. They knew they had their man. And then they found me in my country home in eastern Pennsylvania.
And they moved in next door.
They did move in next door. See, the reason that they did that, and the reason that they didn't just arrest me right away, there was always a chance that I was still active. They didn't even know what nationality I was. If I was born Russian, I would still serve the Russian state. And at that time, both Ames and Hansen had been arrested. So there was a paranoia going on. Are there any other moles in the U.S. government?
Right.
So they were looking at me from a distance because they knew if they got too close, they knew that I was a highly well-trained agent.
Yeah.
So if they got too close, I most likely would find out that I'm being followed, investigated, and so forth. They were right about that. So they spent almost 2 years just watching me from a distance. And there were a couple of alarm bells that rang, particularly because I had a colleague and friend at MetLife who was a Cuban immigrant. He made very good money in IT. So he bought himself an apartment and rented that apartment to a Russian diplomat. He was under investigation. They had an idea that I might actually had an international spy ring. When my wife traveled to England, she was followed by MI5. Mm-hmm. She just went there to visit her uncle.
Yeah, but you guys are high on the radar at this point. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And so eventually they decide you messed up in a way, right? You gave them the excuse to finally arrest you.
Yeah, I messed up. That's when my wife and I had been in arguments a lot. She was insanely jealous. She thought I had affairs with every woman that I ever interacted with. That was the beginning of mental disturbance, let's put it this way. And so we had another argument in the kitchen. She was yelling at me, and I just tried to find a way to save the family and the marriage. I used what I call the nuclear option. I told her, hey, listen, I have absolute 100 proof to you that I can share with you that I am on your side, and I am only here to make a good life for you and the children and myself. I told her what I risked to be with her in Chelsea when I defied the KGB. I didn't know, because in those days I didn't counter surveillance or I did not take any measures anymore to see if I'm being investigated. Yeah. So I was not aware that there was a listening device in my kitchen. And while I confessed to the wife, there was somebody in an FBI office to recorded the confession.
Yeah.
Eventually for them to say hello.
How were you arrested?
I wasn't arrested.
You weren't arrested?
I was detained.
Okay, so...
Detained means they tell you can't go where you want to go right now.
Right.
Arrest means you're at the Miranda rights.
So you're
even if you don't get handcuffs put on, they have to read your rights.
So they're immediately looking at you as a potential asset rather than someone to prosecute. But when they're deciding how to...
And the lead agent in that case had come to the conclusion that, because of his observations, I had come to the conclusion that I was deeply in love with my children. Mm-hmm. And I had every reason to cooperate. Now, they still needed confirmation of that. So when they took me for my first interview, and I call it an interview, it was not an interrogation because I started it off.
What was the encounter like, that first encounter?
Yeah, there was an interesting setup. They made sure that I can't escape. They made sure that I wasn't visible by a bunch of bystanders, so to speak. Nobody knew that they were actually going to talk to me. Mm-hmm. They positioned actually a state trooper they had rented for that event at the toll crossing of the Delaware River from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, where you had to actually stop and put a quarter in a slot for the gate to open. And when I did that, and I was stationary, I was not in danger of fleeing. Okay, the state trooper put himself in front of me and said, "Routine traffic stop, could you please pull over?" Now, again, I was totally not aware anymore. I wasn't sharp anymore. I had forgotten that I once was an agent.
Right.
So I lived a normal life.
Yeah.
So here I pulled over, and then he said something that should have actually resonated somewhat. He said, "Could you please step out of the vehicle?" That's not a routine traffic stop. Routine is license and registration. Pull down the window, but that's it. Yet I still not figured that this was odd. But as I'm stepping out of the vehicle, I see this man coming from my right. And before I could even process that, he came up to me and flipped open an ID. I didn't have to look at it. I knew that it was FBI. At that point, bam. And it was like being doused with 10 gallons of ice cold water, because in an instant, my brain...
Oh, shit. Yeah.
You said exactly what I thought. My brain immediately dug up all the stuff that I had done for which I could wind up in jail for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. And also, instinctively, knowing that this would not be a very good thing for my family, because my kids most likely, my wife most likely could have been extradited because she got her citizenship based on me helping her get a green card. The children might have wound up wardens of the state.
For sure.
All of this was the most extreme thing that could have happened to me. But again, I caught myself rather quickly. This is confirmed by the lead agent, who is now a good friend of mine by the name of Joe. First of all, Joe told me to step into a vehicle that was parked a little further away. His partner was sitting there in the back seat, and I had to sit next to him. And he had a gun strapped to his ankle. It was visible. So we're serious. That's what it said. I asked, am I under arrest? And Joe said, just gave one word answer. He said, no. And then instinctively, I knew that I had to be likable. So I started with a joke. I said, so what took you so long? They couldn't suppress a smile. And that is confirmed by Joe.
You copped to it immediately.
Yeah, and then when they took me to a motel room, they had rented an entire wing of that motel. Before they even could start the conversation, I volunteered. I said, I am perfectly aware that the only way for myself and my family to get out of the situation with the least amount of damage is if I cooperate completely and fully, and I have every intention to do so. That set the tone. That's why it became a conversation rather than an interrogation.
And where did that conversation lead?
It led to them letting me go and telling my wife, I was able to make a phone call, tell her I'm going to be late and not say anything at that point, and making appointments for debriefing. Yeah. That was it. On the way out, I met the guy of the surveillance group covering that entire maneuver. And he looked at me very seriously. And he said, and oh, by the way, if you think of running, don't. We got every intersection covered. Where was I going to go to?
Right.
Even at that point, they still didn't know whether I was Russian by birth or German.
Right.
That all came out in the debriefing. And the debriefing was about 2 hours once a week, asking me about everything and anything that I knew about my life, upbringing, who I was, what I didn't know, everything I could possibly remember. And then I had to pass a lie detector test.
Okay.
It was a must.
And you did. You gave them everything you knew. You passed the lie detector test.
I passed the lie detector test. And at that point, I finally was able to relax because I was told I was going to be allowed to stay in the country.
Before I let you go, you wrote an amazing book about your life. It's called Deep Undercover, My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America. Yeah. And we'll put the link to that here in the description of the show. So make sure you check that out, because as much ground as we've covered, there's so much more too.
There's a companion piece to that. It's an audiobook. It's a audio documentary. It's called The Agent. It's available free of charge on all streaming media. Ooh. That has information that doesn't just come out of my mouth or my pen, but it interviews, for instance, Joe, the KGB, the FBI agent, and other people that were important in my life in the United States. It also has my son Matthias, very briefly. So
he's your son from Germany.
Yeah, the German son. Mm-hmm. That would be very interesting. It was very well made. One other thing, my website is just my name, jackbarsky.com. There's more information about me. People can Google me. There's plenty of interviews that I've given. And if people are on LinkedIn, watch out.
And the links to all of that will be in the description. And you have lived a very fascinating, nonlinear life that I'm sure you've learned lessons that none of us can learn, because very few have had the experience that you had. To finish it up, CBS 60 Minutes actually declared that I lived 3 lives. Yeah.
That's correct. I'm on my 6th career right now.
3rd life, 6th career.
A career, not job.
Right.
different things to do.
What's your career? You're moving into a mentoring career. You mentioned espionage, engineering, corporate America, IT.
Well, I was a college professor. I was a bike messenger.
Yeah, bike messenger. Yeah.
And then I became a public speaker and author.
Yep.
And now I got this one going on. And I tell people, if you want to live an interesting life, don't get stuck in one thing.
It's a great party.
Add a little variety. Using your strengths, because everybody has innate strengths that most people aren't even aware of. And I am now actually living within the universe of my strengths.
Live within the universe of your strengths. That's a great parting thought. And Jack Barsky, thank you so much for being here with us.
Great interview. Thank you very much.